Rick was born in a small town, in a house that seemed to be in a constant struggle against time and neglect. The cracked walls and leaky roof were silent witnesses to a childhood filled with suffering and pain. From a young age, Rick learned that life wasn't always fair. His parents, consumed by frustration and anger, would take their frustrations out on him. Rick was barely 5 years old when he received his first beating for a trivial mistake. His father's belt left marks on his skin, but the deepest wounds were the invisible ones, the ones that lodged in his heart and mind. Nights were the worst. Rick would huddle in his little mattress, trying not to make a sound, hoping his parents wouldn't remember he existed. Often, shouts and blows filled the house, creating an environment where fear was a constant. Every morning, Rick woke up with new injuries and a desperate desire to find refuge, a place where he could feel safe. School was no relief. Although he was a bright boy, the violence at home had made him withdrawn and shy. The other kids saw him as an easy target, and teasing and bullying became his daily bread. Rick wondered if his life would ever change, if he could escape the endless cycle of pain. At the age of 9, Rick decided he'd had enough. One night, after a particularly brutal beating, he waited for his parents to fall asleep. With his heart pounding in his ears, he gathered what few belongings he had and escaped through his bedroom window. He walked for hours, aimlessly, just hoping to get as far away from that hell as possible. He found refuge in a center for abandoned children. Although the conditions were not ideal, at least there were no beatings or screams. However, the foster care system was not much better. Rick went from one home to another, never staying long enough to form a true bond. Each foster family seemed to see him more as a burden than as a child in need of love and support. Rick's adolescence was marked by rebellion and despair. Without proper guidance, he began to fall in with bad company. Drugs and alcohol became his escape, a way to numb the pain he constantly felt. His life became a downward spiral of addictions and bad decisions. Despite it all, there were times when Rick glimpsed a spark of hope. He remembered a school teacher who had told him that he had potential, that he could be someone. Those words, though few, clung to his mind, giving him the strength to carry on, even if only a little. Over time, Rick hit rock bottom. He lost friends, jobs, and almost himself in the process. But in the depths of his despair, he found the determination to change. It was a long and difficult road, full of relapses and moments of doubt. However, little by little, he began to rebuild his life. Rick had spent most of his 50s in a modest neighborhood, leading a quiet and solitary life. He worked at a local pizzeria, and his evenings were usually routine, with solitary dinners and occasional visits to his neighbor, Mr. Freeman. The scars on his body and his aversion to alcohol spoke of a turbulent past, though Rick rarely mentioned those dark times. It was a cool, quiet night as Rick drove his old truck home after a long shift at the pizzeria. Fatigue weighed on his shoulders, and his thoughts wandered to memories of more difficult times. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated a scene that made him slam on the brakes. On the side of the road, a young woman was struggling with her car tire. Two men surrounded her, their postures intimidating. Rick felt a surge of inner conflict. He knew he shouldn't get involved, that he was too old and not strong enough to deal with other people's problems. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore what he was seeing. Rick gripped the steering wheel, his mind debating between prudence and the impulse to help. Finally, he decided to act. He parked his truck and got out, walking resolutely towards the young woman and the men. "What's going on here?" Rick asked, trying to keep his voice firm. The men turned to him, their gazes challenging. One of them, taller and heavier, stepped forward. "This ain't your business, old man. Move along." Rick felt a knot in his stomach, but he didn't back down. He looked at the young woman, whose eyes were filled with panic. "Doesn't look like she wants your help," Rick said, with more confidence than he actually felt. The tension rose. The burly man advanced towards Rick, his fist raised. Rick barely had time to dodge the blow, receiving a painful impact to his side. Despite the pain, he stood firm, grabbing a wrench from the ground and raising it as a threat. "Get lost now, or the next one won't be so easy," Rick said, his voice trembling slightly. The men, seeing that Rick was not going to give up so easily, decided to back down. With a final look of contempt, they walked away, leaving Rick and the young woman alone. Rick dropped the wrench, feeling the sharp pain in his side. The young woman ran to him. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up," she said, her voice trembling. "My name is Sarah." Rick nodded, taking a breath to calm himself. "I'm Rick. Are you okay?" he asked, though he himself was clearly injured. Sarah nodded, though her hands were shaking as she tried to help Rick up. "Let me help you with that," Rick said, pointing to the flat tire. Despite his injuries, Rick bent down and started working on the tire. Sarah, grateful, offered him a bottle of water and helped as best she could. As they worked, Sarah told him that she had left work late and that her car had gotten a flat just as those men showed up. Rick, in spite of the pain from the altercation with the two men, leaned towards the flat tire on Sarah's car. His movements were precise and calm, demonstrating years of experience in solving practical problems. Sarah watched in silence, still shaken by recent events. "Looks like this is going to take a while," Rick said, looking at Sarah with a reassuring smile. Sarah nodded, still trembling slightly. "Thank you for staying to help me. I was coming back from a late study session at the university. I don't know what I would have done without you." Rick began loosening the lug nuts, his mind wandering as his hands worked. He remembered the days when his own problems seemed insurmountable, and how there was always something or someone to help him move on. "What are you studying?" Rick asked, seeking to distract her from the tension. "Social work. I want to help people in difficult situations," Sarah replied with a slight smile. Rick nodded, finding some irony in the situation. Here he was, a man with a past full of mistakes, helping a young woman who aspired to make the world a better place. He continued working in silence, the intermittent conversation between them flowing naturally. As he lifted the car with the jack, Rick couldn't help but reflect on his own life. Every turn of the wrench, every adjustment to the tire, was a reminder of the times he had to rebuild himself. He had been a broken man, like Sarah's car, and he had needed help to get back on the road. Sarah broke the silence. "It must have been difficult for you facing those men. Are you sure you're okay?" Rick smiled, shaking his head. "I've had worse nights. This is nothing, and I couldn't leave you there alone." Sarah looked at him gratefully, her eyes shining under the dim light of the nearby streetlight. "Really, Rick, I don't know how to thank you. You saved me." Rick finished tightening the lug nuts and lowered the car from the jack, satisfied with his work. "There you go. This should get you home without any problems." Sarah insisted on paying him or treating him to a coffee as a thank you, but Rick politely declined. "No need. Just make sure you're safe. That's all that matters." As he put his tools away in his truck, Rick felt a rare sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just the fact that he had helped someone, it was the recognition that, despite his own problems and mistakes, he could still make a difference. He had found a purpose in that small act of kindness. Sarah, still moved, approached Rick before he left. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call me," she said, handing him a card with her phone number. Rick took it, nodding. "Thanks, Sarah. Take care." He got into his truck, the pain in his side a reminder of the eventful night. As he drove back home, he reflected on the turns of life. He had lost a lot, but he had also gained something invaluable that night, the certainty that he could be someone better, that he still had something to offer. He arrived home and collapsed into his old armchair, exhausted but at peace. The image of Sarah, safe and grateful, accompanied him until sleep finally overcame him. Rick woke up with the first light of day, the pain in his side reminding him of the previous night's events. He got up carefully, noticing every twinge of pain as he moved about his small house. After a quick shower, he got ready for his daily routine. The pizzeria where he worked was a few blocks from his house, a trip Rick made on foot almost every day. He enjoyed the morning walk, a moment of peace before the activity of the day. Upon arriving, he greeted his colleagues with a nod and got to work. "What happened to you, Rick?" asked Joe, one of the cooks, noticing the visible injuries. Rick shrugged, downplaying it. "A little scuffle with some bad guys. Nothing I can't handle." Joe raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He knew Rick wasn't the type to easily share his personal life. The day passed without incident, with Rick serving customers and keeping his mind busy with work. At the end of his shift, Rick said goodbye and headed home. On the way, he decided to stop by Mr. Freeman's house. His old friend was one of the few people Rick felt comfortable talking to. He knocked on the door and waited. "Rick, come in, man," said Mr. Freeman, opening the door with a smile. They sat in the small living room, and after a few minutes of small talk, Mr. Freeman observed Rick's injuries with concern. "What happened to you this time, Rick?" he asked, his voice laced with worry. Rick sighed and told him what had happened with Sarah and the men. Mr. Freeman listened attentively, nodding occasionally. "You always have a knack for getting into trouble, but also for doing the right thing," Mr. Freeman said, patting him on the back. Rick smiled faintly. "I guess it's my way of balancing things out." The conversation continued, revealing snippets of Rick's past, his troubled youth, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned. Mr. Freeman, having witnessed many of those stages, shared his own anecdotes and memories. The next day, while Rick was at home, he heard the sound of a powerful engine approaching. He looked out the window and saw a black SUV parked in front of his house. 3 men got out of the vehicle and headed for the door. Rick felt a twinge of nervousness, but he cautiously opened the door. "Rick?" asked one of the men, dressed in an expensive suit. "Yes, that's me." "Who are you?" replied Rick, keeping his distance. "I'm Gerald, Sarah's brother. We wanted to thank you for what you did last night," said the man, extending a hand. Rick shook Gerald's hand, still a bit baffled. Gerald pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Rick. "This is just a small token of our gratitude. Sarah won't stop talking about what you did for her," said Gerald. Rick looked at the envelope, feeling a mix of emotions: gratitude, discomfort, and a bit of guilt. Should he accept this help? He knew the money could solve many of his immediate problems, but his pride and difficult past made him hesitate. As he pondered, he remembered Gerald's words about a job opportunity. Rick knew he couldn't keep living in uncertainty and that this could be an opportunity to change his life. That night, Rick couldn't sleep. He got up several times, pacing the house, his thoughts in conflict. Finally, he decided that he would accept the money and the opportunity, but only if he could earn it through his own effort. The next morning, Rick called Gerald. "Hi, Gerald. It's Rick. I've been thinking about your offer," he said, his voice firm but nervous. "Rick, I'm glad to hear that. I'm sure this opportunity will be excellent for you," Gerald replied enthusiastically. "I appreciate the help, but I want to make sure I earn it. I don't want charity. Rick said, expressing his feelings. "I understand perfectly, Rick. It's not charity. It's an opportunity for you to show what you can do. I trust your abilities," Gerald assured him. Rick felt a little calmer, but the doubt still lingered. "Okay, tell me what I have to do." Gerald explained that he should prepare his resume and go for an interview at Golden Leaf. Rick took note of all the details, grateful for the opportunity. The following days were filled with preparation. Rick searched for his old dress shoes and meticulously cleaned them. He spent hours in front of the mirror, practicing answers to possible interview questions, trying to project confidence. Each night, after his shifts at the pizzeria, Rick dedicated time to improving his resume. He asked Mr. Freeman for help, who gave him advice and reviewed his writing. "Rick, you have more experience and skills than you give yourself credit for. You just need to believe in yourself," Mr. Freeman said, patting him on the back. On the day of the interview, Rick got up early. He dressed in his best suit, the one he had saved for special occasions. As he looked in the mirror, he noticed the wrinkles on his face and his graying hair, but he also saw the determination in his eyes. Upon arriving at Golden Leaf, Rick took a deep breath and entered the building. The reception area was modern and elegant, a contrast to his modest life. He introduced himself at the front desk and waited nervously in the lobby. Finally, he was called into the interview room. Gerald was there, along with 2 other members of the Human Resources team. "Rick, it's good to see you. Thank you for coming," said Gerald, giving him an encouraging smile. The interview began with questions about his work experience and skills. Rick answered truthfully, talking about his years of hard work and the challenges he had faced. He spoke of his past mistakes and how he had learned from them. "I believe perseverance is one of my greatest strengths. I've been through tough times, but I've always found a way to move forward," Rick said, looking the interviewers in the eye. The interview continued with more technical and job-specific questions. Rick did his best, demonstrating his knowledge and willingness to learn. At the end, Gerald stood up and shook Rick's hand. "You did an excellent job, Rick. We'll let you know about our decision in a few days. But I must say, I'm very impressed," said Gerald. Rick thanked everyone and left the building, feeling a mixture of relief and nervousness. He knew he had done his best, and now all that remained was to wait. That night, Rick returned home, exhausted but hopeful. He sat on his porch, looking at the starry sky, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that the future had something more to offer him. He had taken an important step, and no matter the outcome, he knew he had begun to change his life for the better. Rick woke up early. Today was his first day at the Golden Leaf Company. As he shaved carefully, he thought about all the twists and turns life had taken to get him to this moment. He put on his tie with precision, adjusted his clean shoes, and looked at himself in the mirror, recognizing a man who, despite it all, was still fighting to improve his life. Upon arriving at the office, the impressive facade of the building made him feel a slight pang of insecurity, but he took a deep breath and entered with determination. The receptionist, a young woman with a professional smile, greeted him kindly. "Welcome, Rick. Mr. Carter will be expecting you in his office for a quick orientation." Rick nodded, grateful for her kindness. As he followed the receptionist down the halls, he observed the cubicles filled with employees focused on their tasks. The place had an atmosphere of efficiency and professionalism that reminded him of his younger years. Mr. Carter, a middle-aged man with a kind expression, welcomed him with a firm handshake. "Rick, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with a tour of the office." During the tour, Mr. Carter introduced him to several of his new colleagues. Each introduction was brief but meaningful. Rick observed carefully, trying to memorize names and faces. Among them, he met Laura, an energetic and friendly woman who worked in his area. "Hi, Rick. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," Laura said, with a sincere smile. Rick felt a little more relieved by the warm welcome. As he settled into his desk, his thoughts went back again and again to Sarah and Gerald. His gratitude towards them was immense, and he was determined not to let them down. The first challenge came sooner than expected. A problem with the inventory management system required urgent attention. Rick, drawing on his past experience, offered to help. "I think I can fix this," he said, approaching the monitor with confidence. Laura and other colleagues watched him work. As Rick analyzed the problem, his hands moved confidently over the keyboard. After a few minutes of adjustments and testing, the system was back up and running. "There!" Rick exclaimed, smiling at the result. Laura congratulated him, and others also showed their appreciation. It was a small triumph, but it meant a lot to Rick. It was confirmation that he still had something valuable to offer. The following days were a mix of learning and adapting. Each task, each interaction with his colleagues strengthened his sense of belonging. Laura became a kind of informal mentor, guiding him and offering helpful advice. "Rick, do you want a coffee?" she asked one day, while they were both working on a complicated project. "Sure, that sounds good," Rick replied, grateful for the gesture. As they shared a break in the coffee room, Rick felt part of a community again. He wasn't just another employee, he was forming genuine connections. He remembered Gerald's words about believing in himself and felt he was starting to do so. However, not everything was easy. One day, an important delivery was delayed due to a documentation error. The head of the department, visibly annoyed, gathered the team to discuss the situation. Rick, though worried, remained calm. "We can solve this," he said, taking the initiative to review the documents and find the error. The team worked with him, and they eventually managed to fix the problem before it caused major damage. The boss, though still a bit annoyed, acknowledged Rick's effort. "Good work, Rick. Thanks for your quick response," he said, patting him on the back. He was learning to adapt and grow in his new environment, and as the weeks passed, he felt he was building more than just a career. He was building a new life. In the evenings, as he returned home, Rick reflected on his day. He felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that each step he took brought him closer to the redemption he so longed for. It wasn't just a new start at work. It was a new start in his life, one he was determined to make the most of. The transition wasn't easy, but Rick was determined to face each obstacle with the same determination that had brought him this far. Hope and gratitude filled his heart, and for the first time in a long time, he could see a future full of possibilities. The weeks passed slowly, but each day brought a fresh start for Rick. One Saturday afternoon, Rick was finishing up in his garden when he heard the familiar sound of Sarah's car. She and Gerald got out with a smile, carrying a basket full of food. "Rick," Sarah greeted, her voice full of joy. "We thought we could spend the afternoon with you and cook something together." Rick, surprised but pleased, dried his hands on a rag and invited them in. "Of course, I'd love that. I don't remember the last time I had company for dinner." Inside the house, the atmosphere was filled with laughter and conversation as they prepared the meal. Sarah and Gerald shared stories from their childhood, and Rick, though initially reserved, began to open up more about his past. "It wasn't easy for me, you know," Rick said as he chopped vegetables. "I lost my family because of my own mistakes, and it took me a long time to accept it." Sarah, who was preparing a salad, looked at him with understanding. "We all make mistakes, Rick. The important thing is how we learn from them and move on." Gerald, stirring a pot on the stove, nodded in agreement. Exactly. And look how far you've come already. We're here because we value your friendship. Rick smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. As they ate dinner, the conversation flowed naturally. Sarah talked about her work as a social worker and the challenges she faced, while Gerald shared his plans to expand his business. "I've always wanted to help others," Sarah said. "I believe everyone deserves a second chance." Rick reflected on those words. His life was full of second chances, and now he was making the most of every one of them. After dinner, as they cleared the table, Rick felt grateful for the company and support of his new friends. With each visit, Rick noticed how his perspective was changing. His self-confidence grew, and he began to see a brighter future. At work, his colleagues also noticed the transformation. Laura, in particular, became a close friend and confidant. One day, while they were working together on a project, Laura observed him curiously. "Rick, you seem more sure of yourself lately. What's changed?" Rick, pausing for a moment, smiled. "I guess it's because I've realized I'm not alone. I have friends who support me, and that makes a big difference." Laura nodded in understanding. "It's amazing what good company can do for you." Rick realized that his relationships were not only changing his personal life, but also his work performance. He felt more motivated and willing to take on new challenges. One day, his boss approached him with a proposition. "Rick, we've noticed your dedication and how well you've integrated into the team. I'd like to offer you a position of greater responsibility. What do you say?" The offer took Rick by surprise, but it also filled him with pride. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I accept the challenge." At home, Rick continued to reflect on his growth. The walls that once seemed cramped and lonely now felt cozy and full of life. Every corner of his home reflected the changes he was experiencing. Rick was at home, enjoying a cup of coffee while watching the sunset. Suddenly, the ringing of the phone broke the tranquility. Answering, he heard Sarah's broken voice. "Rick, it's Gerald. He's been in a horrible accident. He's in the hospital, in critical condition," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Rick's heart sank. "I'm on my way right now." Rick rushed out of his house, his mind a jumble of chaotic thoughts. The drive to the hospital seemed endless, every red light a torture. He finally arrived and hurried to the emergency room. Sarah was there, her eyes red from crying. Rick hugged her, feeling the fragility of her body. "What happened?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "A car accident," Sarah sobbed, clinging to Rick. Rick held her tightly, trying to remain calm. "We're going to get through this, Sarah. Gerald is strong." The next few hours were an agonizing wait. Sitting in uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room, Rick and Sarah watched the clock in desperation. The ticking seemed a cruel mockery of their suffering. Rick looked at Sarah, his heart aching at her anguish. Every time a doctor walked through the door, they both stood up, hoping for news. But the wait continued, endless and torturous. Finally, a doctor approached them, his expression grave. "Gerald's family?" Rick and Sarah stood up abruptly. "Yes, that's us. The surgery has been complicated, but he's stable. However, his kidneys have suffered irreversible damage. He needs a transplant as soon as possible," the doctor said in a firm but compassionate voice. Sarah let out a gasp of pain and sank into a chair. Rick looked at her, his mind racing. They couldn't lose Gerald, not after everything they'd been through. That night, Rick couldn't sleep. He got up and paced the house, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and memories. He thought about all the times Gerald and Sarah had been there for him, about how his life had changed since he had met them. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. He looked out the window at the moon shining in the night sky. A decision began to form in his mind. He had to do something. He had to try to save Gerald. The next morning, Rick went to the hospital without telling Sarah. He inquired about the process for becoming a kidney donor and was directed to the transplant office. He explained his situation, signed forms, and began a battery of tests. Each step of the process was a mix of hope and fear. Hope that he would be a match, fear that he wouldn't be. But his resolve did not waver. He knew he had to do this, that it was the right thing to do. Days later, he received a call from the hospital. "Mr. Rick, we have the results of your tests. You are a match for Gerald." Rick closed his eyes, a mix of relief and apprehension filling his chest. He thanked the doctor and hung up the phone. He knew what he had to do. That evening, Rick sat down and wrote a letter. In it, he explained his decision to donate his kidney and expressed his gratitude to Sarah and Gerald for all they had done for him. He didn't want them to know until after the surgery. He didn't want them to try to talk him out of it. The next morning, he checked into the hospital, feeling an odd sense of calm and steely determination. The hospital was quiet as Rick was wheeled into the operating room. The fluorescent lights glared down on him, and the chill of the air seeped through his thin gown. Despite his nervousness, a quiet resolve filled his heart. He knew he was doing the right thing. The anesthesia began to take hold, and the sounds around him slowly faded away. His last thoughts were of Sarah and Gerald, hoping his sacrifice would give them the chance to live their lives to the fullest. Meanwhile, in the waiting room, Sarah paced back and forth, unable to contain her anxiety. Her phone rang, and a call from the doctor interrupted her frenzy. "Miss Sarah, we have found a donor for your brother. The surgery will begin shortly," said the doctor's voice. Sarah felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. "Can I know who it is? I would like to thank them personally." "I'm sorry, but the donor has requested to remain anonymous," replied the doctor. Sarah accepted the explanation, though part of her longed to know the identity of the generous donor. She tried calling Rick to share the news, but he didn't answer. She figured he was probably busy and decided to wait. The hours crawled by. The wait was excruciating, each minute stretching into an eternity. Finally, the doctor emerged, his expression tired but satisfied. "The surgery was a success. Gerald will need intensive care for his recovery, but we are optimistic," announced the doctor. Sarah wept with relief, thanking the medical team repeatedly. Gerald was out of danger, and that was all that mattered. Days later, Sarah was still trying to reach Rick without success. Worry began to gnaw at her heart. She decided to go to his house. Upon arriving, she knocked repeatedly, but there was no answer. Finally, she pushed open the unlocked door and stepped inside. The house was silent. On the living room table, she saw a letter addressed to her. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to read. "Dear Sarah, if you are reading this, it means everything went well. Gerald is safe, and that's all that matters. I decided to donate my kidney because it felt like the right thing to do, and I want you to know that I did it with all my heart. Your brother and you have been a blessing in my life, and this is the least I can do to repay some of the kindness you have shown me. I didn't want you to know who the donor was because I don't seek recognition. I just want you to know that I will always be with you, one way or another. With all my love, Rick." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she read. The magnitude of Rick's sacrifice overwhelmed her. She put the letter down and rushed out the door toward the hospital, hoping to hear some news about Rick. Upon arriving, she inquired about him at the reception desk, and the look on the nurse's face confirmed her worst fears. "I'm sorry, miss. Rick didn't make it through the surgery," the nurse said softly. Sarah felt her world crumble. The man who had saved her brother had sacrificed his own life in the process. She couldn't hold back her tears as she sank into a nearby chair, grief and gratitude warring within her heart. The day of Rick's funeral dawned grey and rainy, as if the heavens themselves mourned the loss of a good man. The small neighborhood chapel was filled with people, each with their own stories of how Rick had touched their lives. Sarah and Gerald sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief and gratitude. The priest began the service with a simple prayer, highlighting Rick's life, a man who had faced many hardships yet always found a way to help others. His words resonated throughout the chapel, filling the space with a sense of reverence and admiration. After the prayer, Sarah stood and walked to the podium. Her voice trembled at first, but she found strength in the memories she shared. Rick was not just a friend to us, but a true hero. His kindness and generosity changed our lives forever. He taught us that true courage is found in small acts of love and sacrifice, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked out at the audience, at the faces of the people Rick had touched. There were neighbors, co-workers from the pizzeria, and even some of his former customers. Each one of them had a story about how Rick had made a difference in their lives. Rick always said that life had given him a second chance, and I believe that through us he found the peace he was looking for, Sarah continued. Today, we want to honor his memory not just with our words, but with our actions. Gerald, still weak but determined, stood and joined her at the podium. He placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder and looked out at the crowd. Rick showed us the true meaning of selflessness. He gave everything he had, including his own life, to save mine. There are no words that can express our gratitude, but there is something we can do, Gerald said, his voice strong despite his grief. We will carry on his legacy, Sarah added. We will live our lives with the same compassion and generosity that he showed us. We will help those in need, just as Rick always did. The service continued with several people sharing their memories. A co-worker spoke about how Rick was always willing to cover extra shifts so others could spend time with their families. A neighbor recalled how Rick had helped fix his roof after a storm, asking for nothing in return. Each story was a testament to the positive impact Rick had made on his community. Though he had lived a life filled with challenges, his legacy of kindness and sacrifice was clear for all to see. As the service drew to a close, Sarah and Gerald approached Rick's casket. With tears in their eyes, they each placed a single flower on the polished wood, a final gesture of love and respect. "Thank you, Rick. We'll never forget you," Sarah whispered, her words filled with a promise. Gerald nodded, placing his hand on the casket. "Your legacy will live on through us. We promise to honor your memory every single day." The crowd filed out of the chapel, each person carrying with them the memory of Rick and the inspiration to be better human beings. Sarah and Gerald lingered for a moment longer, standing in silence as the weight of their loss settled upon them. The sky was still overcast, but a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the path leading to the cemetery. Sarah and Gerald walked together, feeling Rick's presence beside them, guiding their way. As they made their way down the path, Sarah took Gerald's hand. "We're going to make Rick proud," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. Gerald squeezed her hand, feeling the same fierce determination. "Yes, we will," for him and for all those we can help. The rain began to fall softly, as if in benediction. As they walked away, Sarah and Gerald knew that Rick's legacy would live on in every act of kindness and compassion they carried out. He had left an indelible mark on their lives, and now it was their turn to bring that light to the world. Rick's funeral was not just an ending, but a beginning. A reminder that even in the darkest of times there is always room for goodness and love to prevail. And so, with hearts full of both sorrow and hope, Sarah and Gerald vowed to keep Rick's memory alive, transforming their grief into action that would make the world a better place. Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Rick's life reminds us that despite challenges and adversities, there is always hope and opportunities to change our destiny. It is a story of resilience, sacrifice, and the transformative power of kindness. If this story has moved you as much as it has moved me, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content. Also, you can activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. I would love to know what you thought of this story and what part touched your heart the most. Leave your comments below, and don't forget to share this video with your friends and family so they too can enjoy this moving tale.